Hello, everyone. So this is the first of, I think, 6 mini note sessions that will be part of the AIMOS conference. So my name's Jennifer Byrne. I'm from Sydney. I'm part of New South Wales Health and also the University of Sydney. And this mini note is titled Correcting the Record. So of course, we've talked a lot about publication today, but the other side of that is what we do when we find research that is no longer reliable. How do we correct that to ensure that the literature is as reliable as possible in terms of supporting future research? Today, we have 4 fantastic speakers who are all going to be talking to this topic from their own perspective. So they'll each speak for about 15 minutes. And I think what we'll aim to do is we'll have a few minutes for questions between them. If we've got any extra time, we'll have a bit of discussion at the end. So we have 2 people who are here in person, John and myself, and we have 3 virtual speakers. So we're going to be starting with John Loadsman. So John is an anaesthetist at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney, and he's also an associate professor at the University of Sydney. So he's going to be speaking in terms of his experience as editor-in-chief of Anaesthesia and Intensive Care, which is the journal of the Australian Society of Anaesthetists. And John's interest in publication integrity was first sparked when he noticed cases of duplication and plagiarism as a proofreader in the 1990s. So John, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Jenny, for inviting me along to the conference. As Jenny mentioned, I'm interested in this field because of experiences I've had ever since I was associated with the journal back in the 1990s when I was a proofreader, and then in the late noughties I became an editor, and in the 2017 the chief editor of the journal. There we go. Now, as I mentioned, I am the chief editor of Anaesthesia Intensive Care, and I'm going to use illustrative examples from some other journals. I apologise right here and now for everything an editor has ever done to any of you. Are there any other editors in the room, by the way? A few. I completely own up to all these opinions. Please don't apportion any blame to the society, my journal, my hospital, or my university. Now, I would say, and the other editors may or may not agree, that we have some very fundamental responsibilities. Obviously, the first one is to facilitate the publication of good science so that we actually have a record, and to prevent the publication of bad science, especially where it involves plagiarism, fraud, and other forms of misconduct, hopefully so records don't need a correction. Now, I would also suggest that what we need to do is follow up on authors who submit bad science to our journals, and not many editors actually do that. They just reject. But I don't think we should do that in case other records from those authors need correction. And of course, we obviously should act, and promptly, if published bad science is exposed in our journal. In other words, to correct the record when necessary. Now, I'm going to use a case of plagiarism as an example of basically the whole spectrum of good response to bad response. Many of you will be aware that plagiarism is very common. From my experiences, often indicative of bigger problems in the paper, and that includes fraudulence, and more recently, that the paper may be from a paper mill. And Jana, I think, is going to talk about paper mills later in this particular session. I'll also mention that screening tool output, like Authenticate or whatever, requires very careful human assessment. You can't just trust the numbers they throw up. It's a very blunt instrument, and the percentage overlap that they report is not a very good indicator of anything. You know, 5% overlap might be 5 very important percents of overlap, whereas 40% might all be quotations. It really is something you've got to look at. But still, a lot of editors and a lot of publishers use percent cutoffs. And some authors and institutions seem to think that some arbitrary percent is okay. I had one Turkish group of authors who were absolutely insistent that 40% plagiarized text was perfectly all right, and that was their institutional norm. Now, the case that I mentioned, a paper was published by some authors in India in January 2010 to our journal. It was assigned to me by the then chief editor, and we ran it through a plagiarism screen called DocCop, which was from a university in Melbourne. It no longer exists. And it turned up extensive plagiarism from a paper published in the British Journal of Anaesthesia. So I rejected the paper and requested an explanation from the authors. In that particular instance, the corresponding author apologised profusely, said it was from inexperience. Obviously, it's from a group of authors for whom English might not be a first language. So to some extent, it's understandable. And the person acknowledged wrongdoing and promised never to do it again. So we decided not to take any further action there after that discussion. But in August of the same year, I got another paper from the same group of authors, same corresponding authors, that also contained extensive plagiarism. Now, that was mainly from a 2003 paper by someone called Munir in one of my colleagues' journals, Anaesthesia and Analgesia, that's based in America. When I looked further into this, I found that there was a previous case report published in our journal, I think in 2008 by the same authors, that had a relatively minor amount of plagiarism, but some plagiarism. There was also previous papers by the same authors in Anaesthesia and Analgesia and the Journal of Palliative Medicine. And the senior author, who we'll call B, also corresponded on those papers. Both of those also contained extensive plagiarism of the paper by Munir in Anaesthesia and Analgesia. There was also another paper by a completely different author, who we'll call M, also in Anaesthesia and Analgesia, that plagiarised the paper by B. Right? Now, Steve Schaefer, who's a good friend of mine, and he was the editor-in-chief of Anaesthesia and Analgesia at the time, who is absolutely excellent. He's involved in fraud busting all over the place. He was informed and took immediate action. The All India Institute of Medical Science were also informed, but quite typically there was absolutely no response, didn't even acknowledge my communication. And I sent it to multiple email addresses, it wasn't just one. And the Journal of Palliative Medicine also was informed, but did not even respond to my communication. Absolutely nothing. So there you have the spectrum, from a good response to an appallingly bad response, even from people who ought to know better. So the submission to my journal was rejected. We sought and published an apology about the minor plagiarism in the case report that we'd previously published. And Steve Schaefer, over at Anaesthesia and Analgesia, meanwhile, retracted both the papers by B and M in the same issue of his journal. But it turned out that there was another paper under consideration by his journal by yet another entirely different set of authors, we'll say N, that was also found to contain plagiarism of M. So we've gone Munir, B, Munir, Memis, B, and then N, serially plagiarising each other. Now, I used to give the last word before 2019 to Steve Schaefer on this one, because he sent me and several other people involved in this case an email where he said, I'm very tempted to include a note about N's plagiarism in the same issue of Anaesthesia and Analgesia, simply for the opportunity to write Dr. N apologises to Dr. M for plagiarism, who apologises to Dr. B for plagiarism, who apologises to Dr. Munir for plagiarism, but fortunately Dr. Munir hasn't plagiarised anyone. Now, you'd think that'd be the end of that. Well, no. Fast forward to July 2019, we got another submission from the same authors. And yes, it contained plagiarism. So I rejected the paper with a note to the institution, again, the All India Institute of Medical Science. And this time they actually responded. Like months later, I got an email from someone with a letter from some important person in the institution. And then to say they were going to do an investigation, that took ages as well. And that was pretty obvious because I provided them with plenty of the evidence. Anyway, they found the allegations of repetitive plagiarism true and said that administrative action had been taken, but didn't provide any details about that. But the person involved, the senior person involved, is still the head of department at the Institute, is still publishing extensively, is the council member of a major international anaesthesia society, is the editor-in-chief of one journal and a board member of several others. So that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with when we're trying to correct the record. What about fraud? Well, it might or might not surprise you to know that I've basically almost given up handling papers myself for my journal, because all I now do is deal with academic misconduct, most of it being fraud. And the reason for that is that when papers get submitted to the journal, and there would be several, at least a week, papers submitted to my journal that throw up red flags for misconduct. Now, those red flags are things that sort of I've recognised over the course of my time as an editor. But Ben Mole, who's going to be speaking next, I think, in this session, has actually published an article detailing some of those red flags. And they include things like, does the paper have weird governance things in it, like lack of ethics approval, inconsistent clinical trial registration? Now, the other thing is most editors don't bother checking the CTR. If there's a number in the paper, that's fine. But if you actually go and look at the clinical trial registration, often you'll discover that the clinical trial that they've submitted to your journal is completely different to the clinical trial that's registered under that number. So, you know, there are things that you really got to look carefully at, and it takes time, and a lot of people don't bother. There are lots of things about the author group that might be weird, like only one author on the paper that's got 300 patients in it, data collected over a couple of months. So the plausibility of the intervention, I'll show you an example of that in a minute. The time frame over the course that the data was collected, and so on and so forth. Baseline characteristics being too similar is one thing that we use a lot to look statistically for fraud, and people like John Carlisle has been involved in that. I would add to those and having a high index of suspicion, because I think one of the biggest problems we have is gullibility. I think we all assume that people are trying to do the right thing, but that's, I think, slowly going the wrong direction. There are some parts of the world, unfortunately, where there is a very high incidence of fraud. So the location of the authors is a potential red flag. Missing or identical error bars. And I don't know if people are aware of a pseudonymous person called Cheshire, who publishes a lot of stuff on Twitter about various things that he finds, I assume it's a he, might not be. And one of the things he posted today, in fact, was a graph, a bar graph, that has the letter T, capital letter T, at the top of each bar as the error bars. So that was only just today. So, and as I mentioned, plagiarism. So a couple of other things that people can use to look for suspicious red flags are listed in the reappraise checklist, which is a longer and more detailed version of Ben Mole's thing. And the Cochrane collaboration also have their own research tool. Now, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, in 2020, a paper was submitted to our journal by a chap from Japan whose name I'd seen a lot in a few other journals, not mine, but I'd seen the name a lot. And it took me literally 30 seconds to get worried about this paper, because this was one of the tables, and it's a table of post-operative pain scores. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with those, but those are 48 hours worth of pain scores. And let me tell you, as an anaesthetist, you don't really need to be an anaesthetist to see that they can't read that. It's just not plausible. You know, having essentially the same pain scores with essentially the same variability across a 48-hour period of time after an operation just doesn't make any sense. That's just not biologically plausible. So I thought, this is pretty bad. So I wrote to the individual and asked for the raw data and the ethics documents, which is my standard ploy for this sort of situation. Most of the time, more often than not, in fact, the authors just tell you to go away. They're not going to give you their raw data. But this chap very promptly provided the raw data. And this was the Excel spreadsheet. Now, the top half is one group, the bottom half is the other group. Now, the numbers in the cells in green are perfect replications of the cells in pink in the same group. So I don't know whether these authors think I'm completely stupid or not, but that would have to be one of the worst examples I've ever seen. I mean, I see stuff like this all the time. Like I say, once or twice a week, but this is just cracking. You know, to have it so obviously laid out that this data is just made up is ridiculous. I mean, I suppose it's possible some of it is real, but it's very clear that at least half of it is not. So that chap is now number 3 on the retraction watch leaderboard. So it turns out that he published a very large number of case reports, which had pretty much all been made up. Not that many randomized trials, but even before the investigation came out, I'd already found problems in those other trials, in a few other journals in anaesthesia, and contacted the editors, and we were all just waiting then for the university to investigate. And in this particular instance, it was very good because within 24 hours, the author had replied, because I'd rejected the paper with a copy to Showa University and the Japanese Clinical Trial Registry. And the author actually replied and said, yes, okay, fair enough, you've caught me, and I am going to be investigated by my institution. And he actually admitted to 2 journal editors that he had fabricated the papers and they retracted them. But then I think his senior author told him to stop admitting to things. So the university got back to me fairly quickly too, like within a few days, and said they were investigating. With COVID and everything happening at the same time, they took a while, but they were incredibly thorough. And that's why there have now been 119 retractions. Fuji, most people have heard about. All the ones in yellow, by the way, are anaesthetists. Now, I think that means we're good at busting them. I'm not so sure that means that we're particularly bad, but anaesthesia editors have worked together for years to deal with this sort of problem. Fuji took best part of 12 years to get investigated and get his stuff retracted. So that was the opposite end of the spectrum. Sato, I was responsible for as well. Back in 2015, he submitted the paper to my journal, almost exactly the same story as before. The data was obviously cooked. It took me over 9 months to get a response out of his institution. That means emailing them, sending them letters in the mail, and sending them faxes to their institutional generic fax number. That's how long it took. So there's the work involved sometimes is horrendous. Now, in 2017, I was contacted by the chief editor of Anaesthesia, which is one of the British journals, about a paper that had been submitted to their journal to ask me if I'd seen any work by this particular anaesthetist before submitted to my journal. And I said no. And the reason was because they were suspicious about the paper from Egypt. And they had asked for the raw data, but the author had refused. And so they wanted some more evidence, I suppose, in order to write to the institution, which they eventually did and got no response. Now, I said I hadn't had anything from this particular anaesthetist. I said, but the second author, who's an obstetrician, might be interesting. Here's 5 of his papers, which all look very suspicious. Now, if you look at this table, it's the same sort of problem. Out of 100 patients in each group, what do you reckon the chances are that the numbers are going to all be multiples of 5, having palpitations, hypertension, headaches, and so on? So Ben Mole is going to talk about this one. This is another case I found, and it was my first time I ever found any image problems in a paper from not in my journal, but the author submitted a paper to my journal, and then I found this in another one of these. And Jana is actually has dealt with this particular one, and she's going to be talking about paper mills later on. And I'm pretty confident this one came from a paper mill. So as an editor, do I find the COPE guidelines useful? Not very, in fact, and sometimes they're being used as an excuse. So as I mentioned, I reject the papers with a copy to the governance authorities, but often it's impossible to find the contact details for those, and vast majority of them never respond. And, you know, looking for publications by the same authors, again, many editors don't respond at all, and most respond fairly inadequately. But all of this takes hours and hours and hours, and it's now taking up more of my time. And you can understand why many editors are reluctant to actually go to this amount of effort to deal with the problem. And that's why correcting the record has been tricky. So there are some people who are trying to do something about it. And Retraction Watch has got a list of the people who've caused a lot of retractions, but it's really a drop in the ocean. But there are several people on the list who are involved in this session. So there you have it.
Thank you, John. We've got time for a couple of questions. Anyone got a burning question for John? Yes.
Thanks for that presentation. I'm just wondering, do you routinely request the individual participant data for all the studies and run any routine checks on those? Given the high rates of fraud that you're seeing 1 or 2 potential fraudulent studies a week, is there a role to routinely check all studies for potential red flags?
I think there is, but I don't have the time to do that. And I don't think any editor on the planet does. So, you know, one day we might actually get the whole open data thing going. One day it might be compulsory for authors to submit their raw data for examination, but it's a lot of work, and you got to pick the low hanging fruit. But I do ask for a lot of raw data. You know, don't worry about that. Lots of them.
Yes, please.
It seems like the way forward is always to contact the academic institution where the researcher is. They're the ones that have to be hammered into something.
But
they don't. But they don't. Why can't the journal just have a Hall of Shame and bar for life these people, and then when some other journal has a suspicious one, they just go to the website. These are bad guys, and they find a guy's name all written out of order, and then just make sure they don't take any paper from that person.
There was some discussion amongst the anesthesia journal editors about having a blacklist, but that would be in very, very, very clear breach of COPE guidelines.
Breach of what?
COPE guidelines.
That's why you said that's actually obstructive.
Yeah, we'd all get in very big trouble.
All right, we might move to our next speaker, who is joining us from the Netherlands. But Professor Ben Mol is he's affiliated with Monash University, where he's Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and he leads the Evidence-Based Women's Health Research Group. One of, I think, Ben's mantras for life is a day without randomization is a day wasted. And Ben is going to join us and tell us that we have the data, but are the data true? Ben.
So thank you for inviting me, and apologies for not in Melbourne. It was just the agenda. It's a bit strange that I was there, what was it, 3 years in lockdown, and now there is a conference going and I'm not there. However, I'm passionate about the topic. These are my conflict of interest, and there is another conflict of interest. I'm angry. So I will talk about the problem, the magnitude of the problem, how we deal with it, and then discuss next steps. So John already gave many examples, but it's just good to see how obvious this problem is. This is 2 papers in my field in the Journal of Fertility Sterility by the same author group, published 5 years apart on different topics with different sample sizes. And these are the 2 tables, and each green dot represents a similar number and a red dot is 1 digit different. So it's very clear that at least the second study hasn't been done, and the authors has just made up these data or part of these data. So one important question is, how big is this problem? And I think I'm very concerned here, actually. So one way not to address this is go to the official retraction sites, because the problem is not only the fabrication, I come back to that, but it's also the fact that the system is not able to retract it. So if you look into the number of retracted papers, then that is only a fraction. But I looked at from other sites. This is work from John Carlisle, who was already mentioned. So he, as a journal editor, systematically assesses data from the trials submitted to his journal Anesthesia, and he comes up with these percentages of false and even zombie, so completely fake data, that go as high as 70% for some countries. And based on that, John Ioannidis estimated that there might be hundreds of thousands of zombie trials around us. So I have shifted in my field to individual participant data meta-analysis, which means that with groups I reach out to authors and ask them to share the data, and that I think gives a better view on what is happening. So this was a paper published in The Lancet last year, where out of I think 49 papers, only 32 were available. And it was already mentioned that some countries have bigger problems than others. So Egypt, only 1 out of 6 shares, and Middle East, only 3 out of 10. This is another meta-analysis in the conventional way, published with 25 studies. But we have tried to reach out to authors, and only 4 out of these 25 are able to share authors. The author of the review has written a paper himself, but he is not willing to share. Another topic in the same field that we are going to publish soon, where 14 out of 37 authors share data. This is the journal club of my hospital 2 weeks ago, where the registrars completely, according to the book, published the Cochrane the Cochrane review and analyzed that. But it's actually clear that there is at least 50% of the data problematic. And this is my colleague Stephen Tong, who was talking on a conference 2 weeks ago about tranexamic acid for the prevention of postpartum hemorrhage. This is the major cause of maternal mortality in the world. And I'm afraid that only one of these papers, actually a large New England paper from France, can really be trusted. I'm a journal editor, so this is work that I do as an editor. Last week I saw a meta-analysis where 12 of the papers in the meta-analysis, 4 were from Iran, 4 from Egypt. So using Carlisle's rate, you're afraid that the meta-analysis is going to use almost 50% fake data. And the last example, Cochrane is starting to use integrity tools now. This is a very big review on 120 RCTs in tocolytics to delay preterm birth, I should say 150. And when they apply the integrity tool, they lose 40 out of the 150 published papers in this area. So the previous slides, I think, show that an estimate that 30% of the published RCTs, at least in the field of women's health, are fabricated is a reasonable estimate. Difficult topic, obviously, to call out particular countries, because you're going to be accused of being a racist. But this is just an overview of the randomized clinical trials in women's health, rated as compared to the gross national product. And you see here that Egypt and Iran are leading the medal ranking, so to say. And I'm afraid that the large majority of what we see from those countries is fabricated. China and India are not as high on this ranking, but they are important because they have a large volume of studies. Even if you have a small percentage, a relatively small percentage that it's fabricated, and then still it contributes a lot. So how do we deal with this? I'm going to now give you an overview of cases that I have brought to the attention of editors and where there is no response. So this is a different article than that I just showed before, but it's very similar. There is clear data copying. This is an RCT from India, where you can see that the baseline tables, the table as you see from the green data, are just copied. I mean, this paper is just completely impossible. And this is table 2. There was also an enormous amount of use of similar numbers. So this is completely fabricated. Again, a paper from Ibrahim. I didn't put the red or the green dots in here, but the 29.3 is a 29.3, the 27.9 is a 27.9, etc., etc. This was a paper that was submitted to the journal on the 31st of January 2019, but the recruitment actually went on until after that period. So they submitted a paper before the study was completed. This is a table that clearly shows fabrication from an author who has published fabricated papers before. 1,000 randomizations in 14 months. That is unfeasibly fast. This is a paper that has baseline characteristics that are statistical significant. So the p-values here are incorrect. And the reason that that is important, and that builds on John Carlisle's work, is that if you have these significant differences, then the study is not randomized if happened at all. Different examples. This was a paper that is really completely bullocks. It tries to evaluate whether early or late induction of labor is a good thing, but it then has a gestational age of 35 weeks in it, whereas the actually randomization is happening at 37 weeks. So this was actually a copy of the idea of a paper that I wrote, but the authors didn't even understand the soul of the paper. This is a paper in fertility sterility, another example as one before, but you can see from the numbers here, 2.05, 2.05, 1.77, 1.77, that is also copied. I made a concern according to COPE to the journals here, and the editor, believe it or not, wrote back to me, "We have received a thoughtful and detailed response from Dr. Hamed. The committee is satisfied with this response and will take no further action." I mean, how to leave a whistleblower in the cold, that's the way to do it. And then the head of from this institute, Ashut, came back to me and sent me the letter that they have got, and not only used ASRM, the wording thoughtful to me, but they also used it towards the fabricator, signed by Dr. Lee Collins, who I believe now is dismissed as chair of this publication committee. So what is the bigger picture? I have written to 800 different papers, because I don't trust them, to different journals and editors. And this is a Kaplan-Meier curve that I made when we were at around 500. And within a year from my concern, only 25% of the complaints have been dealt with. And the editors and the publishers, specifically the publishers, don't seem to see any urgency in this. As a reference, once Cochrane knows that a paper is fabricated, then you have to redo your review in 2 weeks. So I have cases where I had a Cochrane review myself. I flagged the problematic paper, had to push for 2 years. And once it was retracted, I got a message from Cochrane, "Oh, this is really a hurry. Now you have to update your protocol within 2 weeks." Another important thing is there are some editors who share the original data that they got from authors with me, and that almost always allows the proof of fabrication. So what is one of the problems that we have? That is COPE. John already mentioned it. The big problem with COPE is, I think, that it requires to go back to the institute. So this is like you have a suspected athlete from Russia for doping, and then you are forced to ask the Russian doping authorities for an opinion. So I think what should be, it's not that difficult actually. I think we should ask for raw data and ethic documents in potentially problematic studies. After 4 weeks, ask again for the raw data. After 2 weeks, because you don't get an answer again. And then either you have the data and you assess them, or you publish an expression of concern, and that would solve a lot of the problems. There is one author actually, or editor, Tim Skern, who's doing that. He argues of virology. I discussed some COVID papers with him, but he actually showed me that it's possible to solve this in 6 weeks. One other thing to share with you is that John already referred to bigger papers that we write from one author, because I think that is a very powerful way to show what is wrong. When we submitted a paper, the response was, you need to make changes to the language, so make sure that you don't refer anything to misconduct falsification. And Springer said, we have to go to an external legal read at the cost of £500. I don't know who's going to pay this before it can be published. And another paper from Springer, we had that submitted, assessed by the editor through peer review with changes. And then the editor became nervous, sent it to Springer. And then Springer said, because of legal reasons, for the editor, for yourself as authors, our paper is already in preprint, the journal and the publisher, we cannot publish this work. These were 51 papers with clear signs of fabrication. And we also request, because this is legal sensitive, not to share this with others. Well, of course, I'm not going to listen to that. I will now give an overview of the founded legal claims of an author against a publisher or editor for an expression of concern or retraction. That is nothing. So there are cases of defamation, but I'm not aware of any case where in the end the publisher or the editor got damage. To share what it does for myself, it's quite tough. There are groups of fabricators that I challenge who challenge my work. In itself, that's a good thing. I mean, I should be accountable also, but all my papers published in high impact journals that I did with Chinese, with Vietnamese, South African and Brazilian collaborators have been assessed by anonymous complainants. This is kind of correspondence with some of my colleagues in the field who call me a liar in front of a CC with 35 papers. The paper involved is retracted now. This is an announcement of Dr. Fawzi, who I think has problems in his own work. And he has said that he's going to challenge my work, and he has made a document of 500 pages with problems of my work. I think it's important to realize that this happens because I am one of the only few people who shares out. So many people agree with me, but then to state that in the public domain is a little bit difficult. In my field now, the Cairo Consensus Group, believe it or not, on research integrity is going to publish in BJOC, and there are potentially fabricators among the stakeholders who are organizing this. So this is the defense that is happening. This is Manufia University, where the guy with the 51 papers came from, and many other problematic papers from that university. I believe actually that John's paper is also from here. The university now has official policy that data are only to be kept for a maximum of 2 years. So that's their defense against not being able to share the data. And it's signed by Dr. Kandil, who is also a fabricator. So the editor's response are, I don't have time. I get 80 submissions a week. It exists everywhere. Don't worry. We cannot keep up with the number of complaints you send us. Well, I mean, that's because you publish so many problematic articles. So I compare where we are in our field with Boeing, who knew that the software of their stuff was wrong, and they still kept flying their material. So if we don't solve this problem, I think the flavors are we are ignorant, we are indifferent, we are incompetent or corrupt. So I think the ignorance and indifference is going away. So I'll see where this ends. And next steps, I think editors and publishers should start to work together. I think John already showed that he has an enormous amount of expertise, so he should guide others. We should work together at one author at once. I think COPE needs to be revisited and not rely on the Institute, and we need to go public. Thank you very much, Jenny, for all your work in this area and the courage to speak out also. I'm very warmly hearted by that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think we lost a little bit of time because of our technical issues. So has anyone got a burning question for John? Yes? Oh, someone on that. Oh, sorry, God, Ben, I'm looking at you. It's confusing. Ben.
No worries.
Really confused. Anyone got a question for Ben? Anyone online? I'm just looking at the chat. Not sure if I can do that. This could be testing my have a look at the chat and see if we've got any questions. No, we don't. We might have some time for discussion afterwards. Ben, that was fantastic talk. Thank you so much. We will move to our next speaker. Let me see if I can get rid of that. Geez, I'm not very good at this. So our next speaker, I might just need hand to get this down. So I'm not a Zoom user. That's my excuse. Our next speaker is joining us from Sydney. So Dr. Lisa Parker is a medical clinician. So we have a bit of a medical theme today. Lisa is an honorary senior lecturer in the Faculty of Medicine and Health. And she's also currently practicing in the field of oncology, and her expertise is clinical research and conflict of interest. And Lisa is going to talk to us today about her a paper that she published in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology with a number of colleagues earlier this year, I think. And her talk is titled How to be a Research Detective, Warning Signs of Research Fraud. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Jenny. And it's great to be part of this conference. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Terrific talks from you, Ben, and from John as well. I'm just going to share my screen, so let's see if we can get that to work. Okay, can you see?
Yes.
Excellent. That might be
Thank you.
better. Excellent. Good. So as Jenny mentioned, I'm talking about a study that I did with some colleagues, as mentioned here, Stephanie, Rosa and Lisa Barrow, who may be known to some of you. And we're coming from University of Sydney, but also Cochrane and University of Colorado as well. And yes, I'm here at the hospital, in North Shore Hospital in Sydney. So it'll be great to catch up with any of you who are Sydney based. Such an important topic. All right. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack, I suppose, to what John and Ben have discussed, and assume that you all know that research fraud and misconduct are common. Just to note that this work was funded by the NH and MRC, and also Cochrane has been involved in supporting some of us. So a lot of what we've heard about just now from Ben and John are fake RCTs, and I believe Jana's going to talk about paper mills, and I know that's something that Jenny has given a lot of time and effort to exposing as well. Another common type of research fraud and misconduct that we hear a bit about is data manipulation, as well as plagiarism that John talked about. The thing is, it's not rare, but a lot of people do seem to have their head in the sand about it. Fortunately, not the other speakers on this panel, but you might know from talking to colleagues that many people will say, well, it's not a very common thing. We don't really need to worry about it because there's just not that much of it around, but they're wrong. It's not rare, but we don't have a validated screening tool for working out when we should be worried or not worried. So that combination of not being rare, but not having a good screening tool is what our group was inspired by to work on, and to find out a little bit more about this topic so that we could have some information that could inform future work towards a screening tool. So there are some people who are interested in this topic, and these are the kinds of people that we've heard about speaking today. So people in the publishing industry, journal editors, people who are peer reviewers, people who conduct systematic reviews, and some data sleuths or whistleblowers, people who spend a lot of time, and somebody mentioned Cheshire, people who spend a lot of time online often to detect these kinds of problems. So in our study, we decided to seek out these people and speak to them about how do they detect fraud or misconduct? What are the warning signs that they use to find out these problematic studies? And can we use that information to build up a body of work that can inform a more formal screening tool that we can test? So we conducted interviews with a bunch of people from around the world who fit into the categories that I've just discussed. So researchers who are interested in this topic, systematic reviewers, people in the publishing industry, and people involved as whistleblowers or data sleuths. And we asked them, when do they suspect fraud? How do they suspect it? What are the warning signs? And we analysed their results. There's no surprises here that pretty much all the experts we spoke to said that fraud happens. And interestingly, people who were in the publishing industry and people who were whistleblowers pretty much focused predominantly on paper mills and talked about paper mills being like organised crime, just thousands and thousands of papers being churned out by these commercial entities that were sold and purchased by researchers or hospital clinicians for the purpose of CV enhancement. And by and large, people in publishing houses and whistleblowers talked much less about the other types of fraud that we've heard today, the RCT fakes. The researchers who were systematic reviewers that we spoke to talked mainly about those fake RCTs and just were horrified really at the thought that somebody could actually make up data. And you could hear that from what Ben and John have said as well. You know, perhaps we all start out as researchers assuming the best from our colleagues, but the realization has come to some people that actually people just make up stuff, and it's kind of extraordinary. So interesting that there were these two kind of main groups of people who were looking at slightly different things, although all under the umbrella of making stuff up. The experts that we talked to also had quite a bit of consensus about where to go from here. What are the sort of important steps to take? So an urgent need for an easy to use checklist that could help reviewers, editors, publishers, and so on look for early warning signs of misconduct. And a lot of people spoke about how their colleagues felt they didn't have the skills to identify these kinds of problematic studies, and that what was needed was some sort of upskilling, some sort of fairly simple, easy to use checklist that had been validated that could help. And then those studies that were flagged by the checklist would need further investigation. An interesting issue that quite a few people that we spoke to raised was this idea about intention and whether it was useful to try and find out about whether the fraud or misconduct was intended or whether it was just accidental. And quite a few people we spoke to said really that is a problem. This huge focus that we have on intention is a problem because it's really hard to prove that somebody intends to deceive or manipulate or make stuff up. Perhaps what we should focus on instead is whether or not that data is trustworthy or valid. And if we say it's untrustworthy and invalid, then let's just get rid of it. We don't have to prove intention because it's easier just to prove that the data is wrong. So I think that might be an interesting topic for discussion, perhaps if we have some time later on. So we collated a lot of the useful information that we heard from the experts and came up with a bunch of categories. And look, you can slice and dice this in different ways, but one way is as selected here, look at alerts. So look at retraction watch, look at PubPeer, look at expressions of concern, look for ethics and protocol registration, as I think John and Ben both talked about. Look for submission irregularities, and that's probably more something that publishing houses can look at. Were things submitted at an unusual time and peer reviewers submitted it from the same IP address? were there other unusual things that in the publishing submission side? And then for peer reviewers or systematic reviewers, look at the design issues. Is the method and style a bit unusual? Do they not match? Does the font look weird? Is that they're sort of mismatching ideas there? And other results problematic? Are they extreme outliers? And Ben talked about some, and I think John talked about some of this as well. And in our paper that we've given quite a lot more detail about the kinds of things that reviewers, systematic reviewers or peer reviewers, or editors can look at much more closely. And I think John mentioned some of these. There's quite a lot of consensus about these are the kinds of things that we need to look at. So I won't go through all of the details there, just to say that it's similar to what John talked about in the kinds of things that have been published by Ben and his group and by Andy Gray and his group as well. So what do we do when we find these studies that we think are a bit problematic or we suspect there's an issue? And again, Ben mentioned, look at the publications from those authors' previous publications. Look at their affiliations. Maybe they're actually not listed on their research affiliation website. Look at who their recommended peer reviewers are. Check the details of the ethics approval, the grant funding, the protocol registration. Maybe Google the numbers and maybe there are multiple papers with the same numbers. Ask the authors for the raw data, that's key. And if it's supplied, have a look at it. If it's not supplied, then that raises some warning signs as well. If there's capacity, get a statistician to review the stats. If you are a publishing house, get yourself a publishing, an image review expert and get them to have a look at your Western blots and so on and see if there's obvious repetition, swapping around, image manipulation. There's resources and guidance out there. I hesitate now because it's a slide because it's got a Cope comment on there that everyone else has bagged up. But there are things that people can use to help guide them. So Cochrane Research Integrity Group has some resources there. There are some statistics resources, and the one I've got mentioned here is from Jenny Byrne's slide seminar, where she got Carl Sheldrick, who's given a great overview of how to look at the stats. Our paper, which has got a lot more detail on it, is mentioned there as well. And as I said, we're using the work that we've done to build on and look more closely at what should be in a screening tool. And once we've developed a drafts tool, then trying to validate it and get some reviews and see if we can get something that's easy to use, quick, that can flag studies that need further investigation. So I guess in summary, what do we do? Let's be suspicious, because there are a few key people around the world, some of whom are on this talk, who are suspicious, but there's a lot of our colleagues out there who still don't think this is a problem. So let's generate more suspicion. Once we have that level of suspicion, let's utilize it. Let's use a screening tool. Let's investigate. Let's raise the alarm. And I understand the frustration that I've been hearing today, that raising the alarm is tedious and time consuming. And that's a problem in itself. And we haven't talked today, but clearly there's some upstream changes that would be helpful in reducing the pressure on the researchers who are using these paper mills or making up stuff in order to improve their CV, and what can we do upstream to change that environment? And that's a whole other issue in itself. So that was really a pretty quick overview, and I'm conscious that we've already run out of time, so I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Lisa. I think we do have time for a couple of questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for Lisa. We actually, in our group, looked at your paper and was quite impressed by how similarities.
Can you hear, Lisa?
I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little to hear.
I will louder. Our group actually have a look at your paper on the research fraud, and we find it's really, really useful as a guide. So I guess one question that came up in our discussion is that, will there be a concern that once we publish the screening tool and then include instructions on how to look for research fraud, that will be used as a process, as a guide to escape the detectives, and it's going to be like a race between the detective and the fraud.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm so pleased that you found our paper useful. Look, that was something that a lot of the people, or quite a few of the people that I spoke to, raised. And so I probed with subsequent experts that I interviewed and asked them what they thought about that exact question that you've raised with me. And a lot of what I heard was that, to be honest, most of the fraudsters are not that good at it. And most of the fraudsters are really, you know, not devoting the time and energy that would be required to kind of outsmart people who are screening. Most of them are just pretty slapdash. So look, of course, there might be some at the very extreme edge who are working really hard to get around all of these problems. But what I heard was that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, and a screening tool could really help to capture some of that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, one other question. Yes.
You know, there's all these tools to predict whether a paper is replicable or to, you know, catch plagiarism. It seems to me if you've got a specific set of things you're looking for, that's just completely set up for a machine learning algorithm that can go ahead and go over these papers and assign a credibility score to it. In fact, I'm pretty surprised that
Never go wrong.
well, and I'm just saying, it would be if there's lots of papers to go through, it seemed like it would be a pretty good first pass. Go ahead and do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And a few of the experts that I spoke with are involved in designing just those sorts of algorithms. And there's a few different ones. There's the Authenticate that somebody mentioned. There's a stat check one. There's other things. And I think, you know, I hope that that will be something for the future. But a lot of those kinds of machine learning tools focus on sort of one thing. Like they might look at the baseline data table, or they might look at plagiarism, or they might you know, only look at one aspect, and there often will be other things that they might not check. So I'm hopeful that those tools will improve things, but I suspect there will still be a role for a kind of manual screening that a peer reviewer, for example, could benefit from a checklist just to have a look at.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Jenny.
So it's now a pleasure to introduce our final speaker. And I think, Jana, do you want to see if you can just say something to see if your mic's working? Are you still having issues coming off mute? I'm not sure.
No, I can.
Oh,
Can you hear me
yeah, we can hear you. That's fantastic. That's
Excellent.
really great. Oh, that's really
Very
great.
good.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to introduce Jana Christopher. Jana is joining us from Germany this afternoon, where she is based. Jana is an image integrity expert. She's been working in this field for many years. She worked with Embo Press. She has her own consultancy. She's currently working with FEBS Press, which is the Federation of Experimental Biochemical Societies. She works for the Royal Society. She's worked previously for Springer Nature, and she's also working for an important collaboration called the STEM collaboration, which is developing some of the screening tools that I think people have referred to in their questions. And so Jana is going to be giving her perspective as somebody who kind of works on the other side with the journals in terms of her experience in correcting the published record. Thank you, Jana.
Thank you, Jenny, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Can you see my slide? I think you can. I'm just going to go. Okay, cool.
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. So I found this great image at the Oceans Voyages Institute, and I think it nicely illustrates that it's not all just plain sailing in publishing. We're actually dealing with a great big mess that urgently needs cleaning up. And it's a huge job that requires many players to work. So my humble part is looking at images, mostly pre-publication, but increasingly in published material that needs to be corrected and indeed retracted. So I work mainly for journals in the biomedical field, and I see a lot of microscopy images and Western blots and photographs, and also plots and graphs I'm starting to look at now. The screening techniques that I use are applicable to images from other domains as well. So yeah, this is sort of the main body of stuff that I'm looking at. We've already discussed this. The other speakers have mentioned that there's a clear difference between what I call individual misconduct. Sorry, my mic was up. where singular authors might beautify or knowingly falsify their results, and I was just going to mention what Lisa was sort of mentioning briefly, that it's really about unreliable results. And of course, if sometimes we find that authors have very sloppy data management, which then means that the results they're reporting may be unreliable. And this is not necessarily intentional fraud, but it still means that a paper should not be published, just because we can't trust the results that they're showing. And then, of course, there's systematic fabrication. This is businesses that we call paper mills that produce fake papers on demand, and then they sell authorship to these papers to people who, for various reasons, need a publication. Now, Cope and STM have published a report this year. They analyzed over 53,000 papers across 6 publishers, and they came up with this number that the percentage of suspect papers submitted to journals ranges from 2 to 46%. Now, I'm working with journals from either end of that spectrum, and I do work with journals that receive these high percentages of paper mill papers. And of course, we try to sift them out. Most of them are triaged out at the submission stage, but it's really difficult because we became acutely aware of paper mills just a few years ago, and it appears that they have existed for a long time, and they appear to be changing and developing their tactics all the time. So they really are a moving target, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to spot their works. So just briefly, some of the known paper mill hallmarks are I'm just going to go through this quickly because Lisa's already shown a list, and the others have also talked about this briefly. So the study hypotheses are often generic and unsophisticated study approaches. There's errors in the nucleotide sequences. This is something that Jenny's been working with a lot. Then the reference lists often contain irrelevant publications that are often also from paper mills, and these are sometimes already flagged up on papier, so we catch a lot of stuff just by looking at the reference lists. There's often missing ethical approval for animal experiments, substantial changes to the author list during revisions, or even during during the proof stage. Then the authors often suggest reviewers that if you do pick those reviewers, they will provide very swift and positive reviews, and often they review within a couple of hours, which is also rather suspect. Then email addresses are often non-institutional. ORCIDs often missing, and if they are there, they're empty. There's nothing in there. Tortured phrases, someone mentioned those as well. So this is recycled text that's been translated and then translated back in order to evade plagiarism software. Then there's a tool in some of the submission systems that spots submissions that come from the same IP address, and obviously paper mills often submit a bunch of manuscripts in bulk. So we can find them sometimes, even though many mills are now scrambling their IP addresses, and then it becomes more difficult to find them that way. And paper mills will submit simultaneously to multiple journals. Now, what I'm looking at, obviously, is I specialize in images, so we know some telltale signs of paper mill figures. The overall design is often very similar, and it appears templated. Mills use stock images, so typically we'll find straight duplicates of microscopy or other images across several otherwise unrelated papers. Obviously, this is something that you can't find until the child has already fallen in the well, until when the papers are already published. Sometimes mills will use modified versions of the same images. So you might find microscopy images with cloned areas, or photographs of the same tumors that are just arranged in different order. Sometimes we'll see completely invented images, like fabricated Western blots, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. And paper mills will also reuse numerical data and whole data sets, and Ben's been showing this, to generate bar graphs and charts and tables and plots. So this is just another example that I can show you from the Open Biology Journal at the Royal Society, who I also work for. There's whole columns of data that are just copied over, to represent different experiments, which is absolutely impossible, of course. And then this is a version. So these are the same bar graphs in a whole group of papers where the values were all the same, but obviously they used slightly different design in each of those papers, and the labels differ depending on what experiment they supposedly stand for. And funny enough, I even found this graph in another paper where the bars are still the same, but they're shown in a different order. So these are just unbelievable things that you find when you are actively looking for them. Other common issues are cloned data points in flow cytometry plots. So that they just sort of, you get this little cluster that just reappears over and over again. And then reused microscopy images. So in this case, one of the images was slightly altered to obscure the duplication. And I use this technique of color overlays. And here you can see that the altered regions show in yellow, in green and red, and everything that's black and yellow is the same. So we've retracted the paper on the left, AdFeb's letters, just recently, and I think PLOS One are probably working on their retraction on the other one. And then this is an example of reused tumors. I'm apologizing for the disgusting images, just to show that somebody photographed these and just moved them around on the table and took photographs and just put them into various submissions, which is really quite a horrible thing to do, I think. And then, of course, Western blots that are just stock images, and only one of these has been retracted so far. So you can see that the gap DH control has been reused over and over again. And of course, increasingly artificial Western blots created with AI technology. Now, they often look false. They often look, fake, but it's very difficult to verify this because there will be raw data, and often the raw data is unacceptable, but sometimes it does look pretty good. And as time goes on, I find more and more raw data looking, at least plausible. And often you sort of run into a dead end. It's very difficult to really nail someone down. Now, a conscientious journal will request to see raw data whenever they have concerns, and I ask for raw data all the time. And then, oh yes, I was going to talk about this. Sorry, I got my slides in a different order in the end. So these are, this is an example of AI generated Western blots, and SmartCloud found these and posted them on Papier, and I think it's really interesting that in the end you're reduced to finding the same style Western blots across multiple papers, and that is sort of what you can prove. But you don't have much else to really go by, and it's definitely a problem. But at least this is something that we can do. So when we ask for raw data, what will happen is that very often, I mean, obviously this is what raw data should be looking like. You want the full length blot with all the information on it, with molecular size markers and so on. And what we do get does not qualify as raw data. So paper mills especially will send crop plots pasted into PowerPoint or unlabeled rows of bands on really thin strips of film, which you will agree is not helpful and doesn't qualify as raw data. But like I said, more and more of the paper mills are aware now that you will ask for raw data, and they prepare this, and they have something ready that looks sort of more or less plausibly like real raw data, real raw blots. So bottlenecks when we need to retract. So obviously it's much better to catch these things before publication. I think many journals aren't equipped really to do these checks thoroughly enough before they go ahead and publish stuff. So there's lack of resources and expertise to detect mill submissions pre-publication. And then once these papers are published, a lot of journals still sort of leave it largely to sleuths working voluntarily on Papier to mark up these papers and flag them. Once they have been flagged, many journals have limited resources and lack trained staff to act on these alerts, and even at journals with a clear focus on this, that the process recommended by COPE is really lengthy. We've talked about this, the other speakers have mentioned that. On top of that, when you do follow the COPE guideline and you contact the authors, of course, you need to be aware that you are actually corresponding with the paper mill directly in most cases, and they will additionally and actively delay the process. They will say, oh yes, because of COVID the lab is closed and we can't get to the computer and we can't get to the data, and give us 4 more weeks and so on and so forth. And you get excuses like that all the time. Following the COPE guidelines, it takes a lot of time. The process should be adjusted when a paper mill is suspected, and I think there's something happening on this front right now. I'm really on the ball when we get alerts at FEBS Press, and still retractions can take 4 to 5 months easily, even if we're taking action immediately and everything goes more or less smoothly. This is partly because publishers are massively concerned about legal consequences, and they will call for further steps. So they might request a full integrity report on the paper before they authorize the retraction per se even. So even though the sleuths that will post these things on Papier are very reliable and really don't normally make mistakes. And I know these people, and many of them I have, you know, I'm corresponding with. They are reliable, the results that they post, and still we need to, you know, make our own report. I need to check all the way through the paper, find as many things, maybe additional things. Then sometimes the publishers will ask us to adjust the wording of the retraction text, and then they request that the authors sign it off as well. So you have to get in touch with them again. We have to keep author institutions informed. In some countries, this is often impossible. You get standard replies if you get any at all. Papers are often hosted in multiple places, so a retracted paper can still be found on a server somewhere, or on ResearchGate, or even in PubMed Central. So we need to really make sure that the retractions are linked properly. And of course, the other thing that really frustrates me is that expressions of concern take just as long as the retraction itself. So often paper mill articles, even though the journal is aware and is working on this, there is no flag, no visible flag other than PubPeer, which is why I really hope that everyone's got the plugin and can see the comments that are posted. We have seen lots of mass retractions recently, which is really encouraging. So that there were nearly 70 articles by the Royal Society of Chemistry, 500 papers at the Institute of Physics, 100 papers at PLOS. Now, you might realize that these are all journals that basically publish themselves rather than being with a big publishing house outside. And so they have slightly, you know, it's a little bit easier for them to push those retractions through. We have got new detection tools, and there is help on the way. And I think that we really need to applaud this and celebrate this and really use it. There is the Seek and Blast End tool that Jenny works with a lot, and she's published loads of papers on this, checking nucleotide sequences. Then there's a really brilliant image screening tool on its way. It's called Image Twin, and what's wonderful about it is that they don't just check within the manuscript itself, but it also compares images to across the published record, and it will find duplicates, duplicated images with papers that are already published. So this is really, really useful, and it's not quite yet available. I think Jenny's also worked with it, but it's on the way. So this is nice. Then there's the Tortured Phrases tool that Guillaume Cabanac has developed with Cyril Labbé, and Adam Day is working on the paper mill alarm, which was also written about in Nature News, a tool that uses deep learning algorithms to compare the language used, and compares it to articles known to come from paper mills. So I haven't tried this out, but it sounds like this is a really useful tool. And of course, the Integrity Hub from the STM, which will be launched this coming year, is pooling content across different journals and publishers to detect simultaneous submissions and resubmitted retracted paper mill material. This is really a great initiative, and the STM are doing multiple things to try and provide journals with the tools that they need to protect themselves.
We're probably almost at time.
Okay, just last slide, promise. So use your new detection tools. We need more vigilance, stricter guidelines regarding raw data. This is really important. We need swifter workflows when it comes to retractions. And with that, we need help from COPE and STM. We need improved notification and better linked retraction notes to all places where papers are hosted. We need to share our knowledge about how paper mills operate. And we need to collaborate with each other, because this is the best way to really help us in this situation. And that's it. Thank you. I'm sorry that I went over time.
Thank you. I'm just going to see, does anybody have a question?
I have one comment.
Yes,
I find it slightly amusing and ironic that publishers are so concerned about the risks of retracting stuff. And nobody seems to be the least bit concerned about the consequences of publishing the rubbish. Everybody's quite happy just to publish something within days of submission, especially if they're getting paid to do it by an open access option. But then when he turns around and it's time to pull it out because it's obvious, it takes years. I just think it's nuts.
did you hear that, Jana? So John's sort of saying it's a bit ironic. It's so easy to publish, but so hard to retract, you know? What's the consequence of publishing all this rubbish?
Well, I think publishers are worried about it, and I think it's the sheer volume that it is really a problem. I don't think, you know, I don't like to believe that the publishing industry is in itself totally corrupt and they don't care. I don't think it's quite like that. Otherwise, I would be in the wrong job. I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't belong where I'm working. I believe that we can make this work, and I think that there's some good developments going on, and publishers are realizing that there's a huge amount of work to be done, and they are starting to pull their weight. I know it's super frustrating, and when you look at individual cases, then of course it's bad. I know that.
I think we'll probably have to end there. That was a wonderful session. I'd like everybody to join me in thanking all of our speakers. Particularly Jana and Ben, who have joined us from the early hours of the morning where you are. Thank you. Thank you very much to our assistants here in terms of the technical issues that we've had. I think after that session, one thing that we can agree on is we all need to have a drink, or certainly the ECRs do. So I might hand over to Matt.